morning. I want to thank you all for having me and invite you to go to our webpage, skeptic.com, and check out Skeptic Magazine. We are a science organization. We believe that science is the coolest thing ever invented, the best tool we have for understanding how the world works, including trying to answer moral questions. My next book is called The Moral Arc of Science, How Science Has Bent the Arc of the Moral Universe. I mean by science, reason and empiricism, thinking and seeing, hypothesizing and testing to see if something is true or not. My inspiration comes from the great Martin Luther King Jr. in his second most famous speech when he talked about how long it would be before we would achieve this moral justice. And
today, how long will it take? Somebody's asking, how long will prejudice blind the visions of men? I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, yes, sir, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed earth will rise again. Yes, sir. How long? Not long. Yes, sir. Because no lie can live forever. Yes, sir. How long? Not long. How long? Because you shall reap what you sow. Yes, sir. How long? Not long. How long? Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yes, that scaffold sways the future. Yes. Behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. How long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Yes,
how long did it take? 4 months. From that march in Alabama to July of 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed by President Johnson, with Dr. King standing right there. In fact, the moral arc has been bending toward justice for a lot of different groups and issues. Voting rights, I've tracked here the data on states that have passed laws allowing women to vote. The United States in 1920, and Mexico in 1947, and all the way up to, well, Saudi Arabia, hopefully in 2015, will be the last to go. The Vatican City, never. So that tells us where one of the problems lies in holding back the moral arc. In fact, just the narrowing of the dates between when men get the vote and women got the vote has itself been progressing. There's a moral arc there, from hundreds of years to tens of years to no differences. Here's the moral arc of universal suffrage. The blue line is everybody in a country can vote. The red line, by the way, which is a different lecture, is how much money people make in a country. Democratic countries are wealthier than non-democratic countries. It's a good thing to give everybody the vote because everybody's better off that way. Here's the moral arc of democracy. These are democracies that have been rated very highly by the Polity Project, escalating after the Second World War and peaking there in our generation. Here's the moral arc of slavery abolition. These are the number of states that have abolished slavery. Again, you're seeing these sort of hockey stick type curves. Here's the abolition of torture, judicial torture by states. All states have now, at least officially, legally, banned the use of torture. I know the United States is on the list, and it seems like you hear things about torture, so it's not a perfect arc. We're getting there. Here's death penalty abolition, practiced almost nowhere, even where it's legal and illegal in most cases. There's a moral arc of murder decline, the rates from almost 100 per 100,000 to less than 1 per 100,000 in most European countries now. This is moral progress. There's even moral progress in war. On the left there you see states, pre-states, hunter-gatherer groups, horticultural groups, and then off to the far right in the teeny little boxes there are modern states. So as a percentage of the population that dies in warfare, you're better off living in a state society than a pre-state society. Genocides have been decreasing dramatically since the Second World War. Even a tragedy like Rwanda is just a bump compared to the way things used to be. That's moral progress. The arc of decriminalization homosexuality. These are states that have made it no longer a crime to be gay. That's a remarkable achievement just in the last few decades. And that goes along, of course, with the moral arc of gay bigotry decline. That is, people answering questions on surveys about how they feel about gay marriage and homosexuality and so on are moving in the right direction. Nevertheless, still some people believe that gay marriage is immoral, so we have a ways to go. But even those who support gay marriage tend to say that it's not a moral absolute good because there are no moral absolutes. They like to say nothing is written in stone. So I want to ask, here's my dangerous idea for today. What makes something right or wrong? Well, the traditional theory is what's called divine command theory, what I call the ask God theory. The problem is if God does not decree something immoral, does that make it moral? The seventh commandment says, thou shalt not commit adultery, but if it wasn't in the book, would that make it moral? Nowhere in the Bible does it say, thou shalt not rape. Does that mean it's okay? So most of us agree that there are no moral absolutes. Moral principles are not absolute where they apply to all people in all circumstances everywhere. Yes, as a matter of fact, I do have to take everything as black or white. Neither are moral principles relative where anything goes. I don't care what your lawyer said. They're not called the 10 recommendations. So I propose something I call provisional morality. That is, moral principles are provisionally true. They apply to most people in most cultures in most circumstances most of the time. So is this the best we can say about female genital mutilation? And the question, is it wrong? Yes, but only in Western cultures. We must respect other cultural traditions and not judge them. Can we offer our provisional assent that female genital mutilation, female cutting is wrong? I believe we can. Why? Just ask the individual being mutilated and you'll get your answer. If they can't speak words, their screams will give you their answer. So is it absolutely objectively wrong to deface a woman for any reason? Yes, it is. Why? Just ask the individual being defaced and you'll get your answer. So I call this, instead of the ask God principle, the ask first principle. To find out whether an action is right or wrong, ask. Ask the individual moral agent being acted upon. Why the individual? Well, I'm using an evolutionary argument that the individual is the primary target of natural selection and social evolution. So it's the individual organism that counts in our moral calculation. And natural selection still works. So it's good to base it on that. It's supposed to be the funny session here I'm in, so I had to throw that in. So here's the moral principle. The survival and flourishing of sentient beings is the basis for establishing values and morals. So determining the conditions by which sentient beings best flourish ought to be the goal of a science of morality. By sentient, by the way, I mean emotive, perceptive, sensitive, responsive, conscious, can feel and suffer. So I'm using the phrase sentient beings instead of sentient people for a reason, because I think we need to expand the moral circle, push the moral arc further to include animals, sentient animals. And in fact, the rights revolutions are really about the freedom of individuals, not collectives, people, not groups. Individuals vote, not races. Individuals want to be treated equally, not groups. It's individual sentient beings who perceive and emote and respond and love and feel and suffer, not populations and races and groups and tribes and states and nations. In fact, rights protect individuals, not groups. In fact, many rights protect people from being discriminated as a member of a group. Okay, there's a reason we have to do this, so I need to have a show of hands here. We're going to do a little experiment, so if you can bring up the house lights. This is the famous trolley experiment. If you've heard this 20 times, I'm sorry. But so that's you in the audience. You're standing at the switch, and this trolley car is about to run over those 5 people. Unless you throw the switch, and then it runs over the 1 person. So my question to you is, would you kill the 1 to save the 5? How many would throw the switch? Just throw that switch. It's just a switch. You get to save 5 people. That's a simple moral calculation. All right, how about this one? Oops, sorry. Instead of the two splits, you're standing on a bridge next to a big guy. The trolley's about to kill the 5 workers. By the way, for some mysterious reason, they can't hear the trolley. Nevertheless, it's just a thought experiment. They're about to kill the 5 workers unless you take the big guy and physically throw him off. I mean, you got to just hip check him right off the bridge. Boom, down on the track he goes. Splat, he stops the train, and it saves the 5. How many of you would grab the guy and just throw him off the bridge? All right, we got about a quarter of the original vote there, so that's a good sign. What's the difference between the first scenario and the second? It's the same moral calculation. What I want to ask in this old thought experiment is, did anybody ask the guy on the bridge if it's okay? Did anybody ask the guy on the track if it's okay if you throw the trolley on top of him instead of the 5? So back to our individual morality. And so my second dangerous idea for the day is that I'm bridging the is-ought fallacy. This is a traditional problem in philosophy, that the way something is in nature, slavery, predation, parasitism, and so on, is not the way it ought to be. Yeah, sometimes, but sometimes not. Sometimes the way things are should direct us the way things ought to be. For example, we need to eat and reproduce and get along with each other because we're a social species. So we ought to eat, we ought to avoid predators, we ought to find mates, and we ought to get along with our social group. And we do. We do through food sharing and bonding and cooperation and altruism and friendship and love and so forth. There's a whole book on this called Moral Origins about bullying and free riding and how destructive it is to small groups, and how groups then employ mechanisms to deal with bullies. You punish them, you ostracize them, you shame them, and if they're really nasty bullies, you take them out on a hunt and you come back without them. So the way things are, bullies disrupt communities. The way it ought to be, we ought to do something about bullies. There's a famous experiment in which you give people in a common goods game, you give people a wad of money and everybody gets to put some of the money into the pot, and then the pot doubles and it gets divided evenly amongst everybody. If you don't know who it is, if it's anonymous, and there's no opportunity to punish free riders, what happens is, as you can see in the blue line, people get less and less cooperative. They put less and less money in the pot. Unless, in the red line, you make it transparent of who put how much money in the pot, and you give them an opportunity to punish people that cheat or free ride. So we need to have rules to get along. That is, we need some form of enforcement, a shadow of enforcement, so to speak. Yesterday's lecture by Dan Levitin about restorative justice and retributive justice is a perfect example of is and ought. Retributive justice is how we feel. We want to strike back at the person who hurt us. That's the way things are. But we know from science that it's very disruptive and it doesn't work and it doesn't restore the bad thing that was done. So we ought to employ restorative justice and fix our criminal justice system. That's an example of bridging the is and ought. So since the individual is the primary moral agent, and since the survival and flourishing of individuals is the basis for establishing values and morals, then determining the conditions by which we best flourish ought to be the goal of a science of morality. So back to gay rights. If homosexuality is natural, then gay rights ought to be supported. And by the way, it is. And so the thrust of my book is that it is secular Enlightenment values of expanding the moral circle and treating people as individuals as an end in themselves, not as a means to an end. That's a secular idea that comes from the Enlightenment. Religion does not push the moral arc, it follows in its wake. And we can see this with the gay marriage issue. Who's leading it? Secularists. Who's resisting it? Religionists. So here's my prediction. In 3 decades or so, we'll look back at the gay marriage debate and we'll recognize how silly it was that we were even having this debate. It'll be like the black and white drinking fountains of the 50s. And then my other prediction is that the religionists will take credit for it. They'll say, you know that Episcopalian minister? That was our guy. But just note who's actually driving it and who's not now, as a current experiment of past historical trends like this. So I'll finish with just one an actual experiment. What's the best way we should live together as a community? Democracies, we know, are the best forms of social systems for the survival and flourishing of sentient beings. Here's just a data set on the Correlates of War project by Bruce Russett and John O'Neill, showing that democracies are less likely to fight one another. And if you have two democracies, highly rated versus a democracy and an autocracy, what you get is these results. Democratic disputes decrease by 50% when both countries are fully democratic. And when one of them becomes autocratic, the rates of violence go up by 100%. So the formula is that as democracies increase, violence decreases. And you can see it here, and I'll just finish with this last example here. This is the difference between North Korea and South Korea. There's a 1,750% difference in GDP and quality of living, as you can see here in the difference between North Korea and South Korea in the satellite photo, and the difference in height between North Koreans on the left and South Koreans on the right. So the bottom line is that once science tells us the way things are, it can inform us on the way things ought to be. We ought to spread democracy. We ought to spread reason and science as a tool for solving social problems, including moral problems. Thank you. Yep, sure.
Michael, just one question. Forget about GDP. There is probably something even more important than that. Richard Tapp Posner wrote a book, well, he has an article, Bob Kutter knows pretty well about it, that un aplauso para el profesor Robert Kutter de Berkeley, que se encuentra con nosotros. Bob Kutter, welcome. Where slavery in a way could be, or it is much more productive and could make much more GDP and could make people probably richer. I mean, not the slaves, of course, but it's really the issue, the GDP, because there are some cases like slavery that probably you could make much more money or much more and increase the GDP, but that doesn't make it.
Yes, of course, right. Yeah, no, it's a great question. You know, I can't do it in 13 minutes, but basically the tension there is like the guys on the track. The utilitarian calculus is, well, we should do this because look, it saves more people or more people get wealthy or whatever. Sure. No, I'm saying that it's the individual that counts first. And then look what happens when you grant more freedoms and liberty and democracy and so on. Nations get richer. So I think the freedoms and liberties and democracies come first. The wealth it's not a direct byproduct, but it's related to that.
If you begin with Kant, you end with Stuart Mill.
Yes, right.
Thank you very much. Un aplauso, por favor.